So there were lots of them. Peter heard how stupid it sounded, but he couldn't help repeating it. Lots. He plowed his fingers through the heap of plastic soldiers in the battered cookie tin. Identical except for their poses, standing, kneeling, and prone, all with rifles pressed hard to their olive green cheeks. I always thought he just had the one. No, I was always stepping on them. He must have had hundreds, a whole army of them. The grandfather laughed at his own accidental joke, but Peter didn't. He turned his head and looked intently out the window, as if he had just caught sight of something in the darkening backyard. He raised his hand to draw his knuckles up to his jaw line, exactly the way his father rasped his beard stubble, and wiped surreptitiously at the tears that had brimmed. What kind of baby cried about something like this? And why was he crying at all, anyway? He was 12, and he hadn't cried for years, not even when he'd fractured his thumb bare-handing Josh Horihan's popfly. That had hurt a lot, but he'd only cursed through the pain waiting with the coach for x-rays. Man up! But today, twice. Peter lifted a soldier from the tin and drifted back to the day he'd found one just like it in his father's desk. "What's this?" he'd asked, holding it up. Peter's father had reached over and taken it, his face softening. Huh? Been a long time. That was my favorite toy when I was a kid. Can I have it?" His dad had tossed the soldier back. "Sure." Peter had set it up on the windowsill beside his bed, pointing the little plastic rifle out in a satisfying show of defense. But within the hour, Pax had swiped it, which made Peter laugh, just like him. Pax had to leave. Pax had to have it. Peter dropped the toy back into the tin and was about to snap the lid back on when he noticed the edge of the yellowed photo sticking up from the mound of soldiers. He tugged it free. His dad, at maybe 10 or 11, with one arm draped around a dog. Looked like a part collie, part 100 other things. Looked like a good dog, the kind you would tell your own son about. "I never knew Dad had a dog," he said, passing the photo to his grandfather. "That's Duke. Dumbest creature ever born. Always underfoot." The old man looked more closely at the picture and then over at Peter as if seeing something for the first time. "You've got the same black hair as your dad." He rubbed at the fringe of gray fuzz banding the top of his head. "I had it too, way back. And look, he was scrawny then too. Same as you, same as me, with those ears like a jug. The men in our family. I guess our apples don't fall far from the tree, eh?" "No, sir." Peter forced a smile. But it didn't hold up. Underfoot. That was the word Peter's father had used. "He can't have the fox underfoot. He doesn't move as fast as he used to. You stay out of the way, too. He's not used to having a kid around. You know, war came and I went and served like my father, like your father now. Duty calls, and we answer in this family. No, sir, our apples don't fall far from the tree." He handed back the photo. "Your father and that dog, they were inseparable. I'd almost forgotten." Peter put the photo back into the tin and pressed the lid down tight, then slid it under the bed, where he'd found it. He looked out the window again. He couldn't risk talking about pets right now. He didn't want to hear about duty, and he sure didn't want to hear any more about what apples in the trees they were stuck underneath. "What time does school start here?" he asked, not turning around. 8. They said to show up early. Introduce yourself to the home route teacher, Mrs. Ramirez, or Ramirez. Something. I got you some supplies." The old man nodded over to a spiral notebook, a beat-up thermos, and a bunch of stubby pencils bundled together with a thick rubber band. Peter walked over to the desk and put everything into his backpack. Thanks. Bus or walk? Walk. Your father went to that school and he walked. Follow Ash to the end, turn right on School Street, and you'll see it. Big brick building. School Street, get it? You leave by 7:30. You'll have plenty of time. Peter nodded. He wanted to be left alone. Okay, I'm all set, I guess. I'll go to bed. Good, his grandfather replied, not bothering to hide the relief in his voice. He left, closing the door behind him firmly as if to say, you can have this room, but the rest of the house is mine. Peter stood by the door and listened to him walk away. After a minute, he heard the sound of dishes clattering in the sink. He pictured his grandfather in the cramped kitchen where they'd eaten their silent dinner of stew. The kitchen that reeked so strongly of fried onions that Peter figured the smell would outlive his grandfather. After 100 years of scrubbing by a dozen different families, this house would probably still smell bitter. Peter heard his grandfather shuffle back along the hall to his bedroom, and then the low sparked as the television caught the volume turned down. An agitated news commentator barely audible. Only then did he toe off his sneakers and lie down on the narrow bed. 6 months, maybe more, of living here with his grandfather, who always seemed on the verge of blowing up. What's he always so mad about anyway? Peter had asked his father once years ago. Everything. Lie, his father had answered. He got worse after your grandmother died. After his own mother had died, Peter had watched his father anxiously. At first, there had just been a frightening silence, but gradually his face had hardened into the permanent threat of a scowl, and his hands clenched in the fists by his sides as if itching for something to set him off. Peter learned to avoid being that something, learned to stay out of his way. The smell of stale grease and onions crawled over him, seeping from the walls. From the bed itself, he opened the window beside him. The April breeze that blew in was chilling. Pax had never been alone outside before, except in his pen. Peter tried to extinguish the last sight he'd had of his fox. He probably hadn't followed their car for long, but the image of him flopping down on the gravel shoulder, confused, was worse. Peter's anxiety began to stir. All day, the whole ride here, Peter had sensed a coiling. It's always seemed like a snake to him, his anxiety, waiting just out of sight, ready to slither up his spine, hissing its familiar taunt. You aren't where you should be. Something bad is going to happen because you aren't where you should be. He rolled over and pulled the cookie tin out from under the bed. He fished up the photo of his father with one arm slung so casually around the back and around the black and white dog, as if he had never worried he could lose him. Inseparable. He hadn't missed the note of pride that had entered his grandfather's voice as he'd said that. Of course he'd been proud. He'd raised a son who knew about loyalty and responsibility, who knew that a kid and his pet should be inseparable. Suddenly the word itself seemed an accusation. He and Pax, what were they then? Separable? They weren't, though. Sometimes, in fact, Peter had the strange sensation that he and Pax merged. The first time it happened had been the first time he'd taken Pax outdoors. The kit had seen a bird and had strained against the leash, trembling as though electrified, and Peter had seen the bird through Pax's eyes. The miraculous lightning flight, the impossible freedom and speed. He'd felt his own skin thrill in full body shivers, and his own shoulders burn as though yearning for wings. It had happened again this afternoon. He had felt the car spin away, though he were the one being left. His heart had quickened with panic. Tears stung again, and Peter palmed them with frustrated wipes. His father had said it was the right thing to do. War's coming. It means sacrifices for everybody I have to serve. It's my duty, and you have to go away. Of course, he'd been half expecting it. 2 of his friends' families had already packed up and left when the evacuation rumors had begun. What he hadn't expected was the rest, the worst part. And that fox, well, it's time to send him back to the wild anyway. A coyote howled then, so nearby it made Peter jump. A second one answered, and then a third. Peter sat up and slammed the window shut, but it was too late. The yips and howls and what they meant were in his head now. Peter had only 2 bad memories of his mother. He had a lot of good ones too, and he often took those out to comfort himself, although he worried they might fade.